saw the Cinema Novo series at Museum of Modern Art. I think it was 1969, 1970. And I saw there Terence Tran's Land in Anguish. And, and also was Fuzi's. But Land in Anguish was very, very strong. I felt I had never seen anything quite like the combination of styles and, quite honestly, just the humanity and the passion of the film was so powerful. So when Antonio Das Mortas opened at the Bleecker Street Cinema, and I saw the name Rocha, I went immediately to see this. And I don't think at that time, you have to understand it's a very different time. At that time, every day, or maybe I exaggerate, every 3 days, there was a new masterpiece. From Italy, from France, from Japan, from everywhere. I mean, it was all over. And all of a sudden, Antonio Das Mortas comes on the screen and wipes them all away. And I can only say this from an emotional standpoint because I don't have the intellectual background of understanding the politics and understanding the nature of what was going on in Brazil at the time. I really come from a working class background of Sicilians in the Lower East Side of New York, which was like living in a little village, until I went to Washington Square College, which was New York University, which was in Greenwich Village. And then it began to open up a little bit, and this extraordinary influx of films, of recreating, you have to understand, not just good movies, but recreating cinematic language was happening every 3 or 4 days from different parts of the country. Not even to mention Andy Warhol or Cassavetes, for example. This was the key in 1968, actually 1959 with Shadows. So this was a time when we all expected anything could happen with cinema, and cinema was going to be the savior of the world in a sense, and the world being in a terrible state, maybe not as bad as it is now, but at that time a very bad state politically and in every way. And so when I saw Antonio Das Mortas, it seemed to cut through all politics, made politics irrelevant in a way, because it dealt with a truth and a passion that was primal. That was, there are those who have and those who have not. And those who have not will be heard, and eventually will come from the earth. It's almost as if it's something that was from primeval times, where the people in the film look as if they came out of the earth. This is like a primal mythology that was created up there on the screen, but interestingly enough, not just from the tradition and the culture of Brazil, which was kind of new to me, but also from different cultures and different styles of filmmaking. From Italy, from America, from the American Western, as translated through the Italian Western, which at that time, we were such diehard American Western enthusiasts, having grown up with them as young boys, John Ford, Howard Hawks, etc., Bud Bedecker, and of course at that time Sam Peckinpah was the final statement of the American Western. We were so at that time so militant about the American Western that we reacted, myself and a number of other people reacted against the Leone films. We felt that, the Italians can't make it Italian. I love Antonioni, we love Fellini, we love De Sica, of course, Bertolucci, Bellocchio, so much Pasolini, but the Western, this is American. It took me, in the meantime, I saw Antonio Das Mortas, but I did not have that feeling about Antonio. Antonio Das Mortas is something different. It took elements of the Western. It took elements of the translation of the Western by Leone and the other Italians. It took me 4 years to begin to appreciate, 4 or 5 years to begin to appreciate really beyond that point, the Leone films. And that Once Upon a Time in the West then became one of my favorite films. And I had to learn to come to it that it was not a Western, that it's an Italian film, that it's more in the tradition of grand opera. Leone's style was so extraordinary and so unique. And that it took me a number of years. I got to know Leone, and then actually, at one point, back in 1978, gave me a print of Once Upon a Time in the West, which I kept here with our collection. But the thing about Antonio Das Mortas was that, yes, it takes elements of the American Western, but also translated through the Italian Western at that time. There were, how can I say, I can't I could not react to the picture analytically because I was overwhelmed by the film, and I was overwhelmed by the style of the film, and by, again, just the truth over politics. And what I mean by that is that the politics are there. It's obvious. But I hadn't seen it handled with such honesty and in such an interesting way. And I hadn't seen it handled that way since I saw the first neorealist films of De Sica and Rossellini when I was 5 years old, which was Bicycle Thief and Paisa. And they were of a different style, but that hit the truth in a certain way, and Antonio hits that way in the same manner. I had a similar feeling to seeing Pasolini's first film, Accattone, around the same time. But Antonio dos Mortos goes off on another level, because it comes out, the ritual, even though I may not have been familiar with some of the rituals depicted in the picture, they create an atmosphere where anything is possible. And you could follow the story to a certain extent. You understand the nature of the story, but the sense of the dispossessed and the sense of the dispossessed are always with us, and that they will be heard from. This is inevitable, and you get this from his work. You get this in particular Antonio, and also, of course, in Land in Anguish. And so, for me, ultimately, I became obsessed with the film, and I remember I took my friend from Time magazine, Jay Cox, to see it, and he reacted against it, but years later he liked it. There's no day. He was sort of a reviewer. He was reviewing at the time, and you have to understand that reviewers of periodicals have to see 4 or 5 films a day, 3 films a day. You know, suddenly this thing comes on the screen. He thought it was too excessive, too over the. I said, no, this is really important. We got to meet Glauber when he came to New York that time, in a restaurant uptown, just for coffee. And the Time magazine gentleman did an interview of him. And that's when I first met him. And it took a few years, but my friend came around. He was the same. He also, with me, reacted against the Leone films, and then years later it came around. So, but with Antonio dos Mortos is something, the style is very important. There are elements, as I say, of the Western, of course, but, and this is pretty obvious in terms of the cangaciero and the type of bandit Americans can immediately, who've seen American cinema, Westerns can immediately equate with that. But it's also there's something about the nature of the music. The music, for me, is narrative in the film. It tells the story, the music. And I became obsessed with the music. I finally got copies of all of it, and I put it on my audio tape. And when I was driving, I was living in Los Angeles in 1972 to 1983, and I played in the car all the time. And the thing about it, I started giving copies of the film to musicians, composers, to look at that time in Los Angeles, actors. But primarily, the thing is that the narrative is told through the music also. Now, I don't know, I'm not an authority on it, so I can't tell you, you know better than me, all the different meanings of the different types of music used in the picture. But there is one important thing, and it has to do with the ballad, the idea of probably one of the most extraordinary things in that film is the moment in which the old blind man is carried on a litter, and the camera just tracks along with him. They're preparing for the final battle, and the camera goes on and on and on and keeps tracking. And this extraordinary ballad is being sung on the track, with these great lyrics about Lampiao, I believe, and going down to hell and fighting all the devils. And come to think of it, we were talking about it the other day, and we were talking about that in a way he, at that time, was using film, using Antonio dos Mortos is using cinema sort of as powerful as Bob Dylan, the music and the songs that Bob Dylan was writing and playing at that time, Masters of War, particularly that particular song, that particular ballad, and Antonio de Mortis is like a Rolling Stone. It just goes, and like if you listen as an American, I don't know about foreigner, but if you listen to like a Rolling Stone repeatedly, which I just did a documentary on Bob Dylan, it still has the power. The song still has the power, and this is something that over the years I began to realize about the use of music in this film. But automatically, I must say, I responded to the film emotionally, and I responded to the truth of the street. The truth of the earth. In other words, as I said, the people who have not will be heard from. And I think this is something that there will be a day of reckoning. And I think this film shows that. And I think all of Cinema Nuovo, I think at that time, was expressing that. I mean, the whole world was going that way, and it is that way now, too. Antonio de Mortis makes it very clear it's the haves and the haves not. You know, you could give or you could take. You could share. And the ones who don't, they're going to come out of that from that wherever they were. Serato is called the area where the woman with the knife, the extraordinary rituals they're enacted. And one of the greatest moments in the picture too is the way the intensity builds with the music. It becomes like a ritual. It becomes like a religious chant or an incantation. There's a moment where an older woman starts singing, and I think it's when Antonio de Mortis starts to fight for the first time with another of the congaceros. They put the handkerchief between themselves. One bites the one end of the handkerchief, the other bites the other, and it's all one take. And recently, when I screened the film again, I screened the film twice the past few years. Once for Gangs of New York, and once for this film, The Departed, this gangster film I'm doing. And again, if you watch that take, how all the elements fall together, how you watch from the beginning of the take, I think it's about a 10-minute take. There's dialogue, and then the two characters move. Suddenly the sky, I think it starts to rain or something. You begin to hear a woman singing, and then they start to fight, and I think it looks very real, where one of the characters gets hit with a knife. And the tension of the two men pulling on the handkerchief, the camera moves. The camera moves create something that is an extraordinarily emotionally powerful moment. But it's that kind of thing too, where you know everything is working for the filmmaker when all those elements come together. I don't know whether it's the actors, the weather, the camera movement. Somehow, if he had designed it, I'm sure he did. But somehow, when you're working like that with a group, and I could see that everyone was, committed to making something special. And I say it all comes together, you know. And so this is a very, you know, that's one. It's one of the high points of my film going experiences, to see this and to be enlightened by this picture. And because also, you know, the interesting thing about the Rocha films is that there was no attempt at, I shouldn't say, he dealt with similar subject matter that was coming from Europe, but dealing with the European society post-war. But he dealt with it in such a way that was so direct, and so it may have elements of the Baroque, it may have elements of as I say, the Western, and so many other different elements, but there was something about it that there were no excuses. I think one of the reasons I've shown this to actors over the years, or I've shown it to cinematographers, was again to break through, because to break through a kind of prison of the system, you know, in a way. You have so many wonderful young actors who, unfortunately, at times are used by the system. You know, they come out of an independent film, let's say, you know, and then they do wonderful performances. Then they're put in a big Hollywood film, which is about a cartoon character. The film doesn't do too well. The actor doesn't work again, and doesn't work again for maybe 2 or 3 years, or 2 or 3 films, maybe, which is like a year and a half. And I think it becomes like a monster. It's eating its young, you know. And I think one of the things is not only that, but the actor also has to deal with, on a big screen, in the system and the industry the way it is. And I'm talking about Hollywood. I'm talking about, and even though I'm in New York, my films are still financed by Hollywood. So we have a situation that younger people, very talented, the promise of the actors over the years, like a Brando or a Dean or Montgomery Clift, people like that of today, sometimes get self-destruct because they're put in a system that has to pay attention every day to the publicity, to which parties they're going to which screening they're invited to. You could be invited to a screening which is the A list, and you could be on the B list. You'll find out later you may be on the C list, which means you've lost position in town. Now, this happens all the time. This happens all the time in any industry, particularly in Hollywood. But there's something that's happened with the society now because of the materialism and the consumerism gone mad and rampant that happens faster. And something like this, something like Rocha's work, to show to actors who have a core of wanting to do something more than becoming part of a system. It might shock them into having fortitude and strength and overcoming those problems. You could do it. Some have done it over the years. Some have done it. There have been great actors who started in the 60s are still working, you know. But I see now what's happening is that people are used up in two days and gone. And I see pictures like this. I say, remember, this is also cinema. This also can happen. This is also film. This is also movies. Because cinema sometimes has a bad connotation in terms of becoming, something that is counterculture. And so our dream at the time in the late 60s, I hadn't made films when I met Glauber Rocha. I hadn't made films at that point when I first met him, when I first saw these films. And our dream at the time in this, what happened with that whole group in California, when we went to California, was to make new pictures that, shall I answer that for you? No, wait. Our goal. We thought we were going to make a new cinema of some sort, and this is not just from. It was the decline. I mean, Rocha and many of the people at that time were talking about the decline of the Hollywood system and Hollywood cinema. That's true, but I guess we became a new group that came in, and we tried up until about 1980, 81. It lasted, and then that was over. That doesn't mean it can't exist. It doesn't mean it still can't work. I think it can work, and I think a lot of that is happening with American cinema since the late 80s, all through the 90s, with independent cinema to a certain extent. But that can also fall into a kind of what's the word? You show pictures to people who already agree with you. You know what I'm saying? People who you get a social topic, and you show a very heartfelt film about some sort of social problem, and who's going to argue? So, it's well made. It is well made. They acted well, but you should go further and use cinema as a language. And now, when these pictures came out, they were talking about 16 millimeter, John Cassavetes shooting, Faces in 16 millimeter being shown on big screens in America and all over the world. The Maisel brothers, Penny Baker, all these films being shown on Saturday nights here, right around the corner here in major theaters, like regular features from Hollywood, only made with a new approach to cinema. All over Europe this happening too, and in Japan. And at that time it looked like there would be a new language of cinema in a way, and people were redefining it. Now that's upon us again, and it has to do with digital video, and has to do with the ability of anybody to pick up a camera. And once they want to tell a story with that camera, they've got to look through the eyepiece. And when you do that, you have to frame it. You have to let the person who's going to see that, understand what you want to tell them, which means you're going to be a filmmaker. Now, if you have something to say, it's a very powerful medium that's happening right now. There's so many different ways. And now there's talk, and I guess it's happening, that, again, I'm not sure if this is would be considered cinema anymore, but films like great Hollywood films, or films like great European or Asian films, South American films, being shown on iPods. Well, I don't know if the film was made to be seen that big on a screen, that small, I should say, and that size. And so that becomes something else. And it's being redefined and reinvented. as we speak, and it's a very powerful medium, you know. I mean, the computer, the internet, and that sort of thing. This is something that nobody, when these films were made, nobody had thought of. So it's open again. And I think what has to happen is that we have to keep shocking and, in a way, shaking up the young talent and saying, don't get caught up with, you know, not only in the main system, but also with the heartfelt independent film. Well, the violence in Antonio dos Mortos is stylized. But the problem is that it's not, it reminds me of a ritualistic violence. It reminds me of rituals that are played out where people don't get hurt, but one plays out the violence. So there's a distancing in a way. Now, yet, I know that I read about Rocha over the years. I know about Bertolt Brecht and all. I never understood that. I mean, I don't know. I come, as I say, it took me years to come around to where other people were when these films were made. And I was never an intellectual that way, and still am not. But the point is that the distancing didn't matter. I still felt the power. I knew what those images meant, and I knew what that violence meant, even though the violence was not necessarily shown realistically. You see. And that I don't say it's good or bad. I'm just saying that it didn't matter to me. And certainly, coming off of Bonnie and Clyde Made in America or The Wild Bunch or Sam Peckinpah, as I say, this if anything, is tied directly to the violence that was expressed in a certain manner in the Leone films. More Italian, more European. But also Japanese. I also felt a very strong association with Japanese cinema, too, when I saw Rocha's pictures. Sort of like Japanese and Italian cinema mixed together, I used to say. And I was trying to struggle to find out what it was, to find out where all these styles came from. But then I realized, too, I think about Terem Trans, and I look at it now, and you see Welles, you see Orson Welles, you see Eisenstein, of course. You know, and whenever I make a picture, you know, the first thing I do to jumpstart, if anything's left, I run Russian films of the 1920s. It's Eisenstein, Doshenko, Dziga Vertov, some Podovkin, some Kuleshov. But now these days Doshenko I like a lot. And if I can, Antonio dos Mortos or Terem Trans, you know, and that's just to push the mind working. That's to refresh the memory, or should I say, if there is anything left, to refresh the inspiration, to be inspired, just to be around great cinema, to see it and to be part of it, just to be in the room. You don't even have to look at it. You could be there in the room while it's being projected, you know. And so, for me, I think my eye caught, particularly Terem Trans, my eye went directly towards it because I think my eye was attuned to Wellesian cinema, Orson Welles. I liked Welles's films a lot.
Um homem não pode se dividir assim. A política e a poesia são demais para só homem.
And so I came from a very conservative background, and in the early 60s is when I started to become aware of different ways of thinking, political thinking, and that sort of thing. I was maybe 16 or 18 when this began to happen. And so, in a way, for me, I always responded to the poetry. And I think with Rocha's pictures, that's what I'm saying. I went in, I responded to the poetry of the film. The politics were there. That's why I say it's beyond the politics, you know, because the poetry is so strong that it's eternal. It's about mankind. It's not just about a political system, and or against a political system. It goes beyond that. That's why it'll always be fresh and new. And so I think, for me, that if the two can't exist together, the way he says, politics and poetry can't exist together, the poetry has the politics. No matter what you do, it's political. And I think this is something that, again, the younger people of today could maybe benefit from seeing in these films. I mean, it's obvious in Terem Trans because it's about politics, in a way. But it's different about politics than the way, say, All the King's Men is. the Robert Penn Warren novel that was made into a film, and this new film coming, a new version coming out on that. It's a different thing. And the thing about Terem Transit, I mean, is when I saw that at the Museum of Modern Art, I never saw a reaction to a film that way. There was the last shot of the man firing the gun. It's widescreen, 185, and he's on the corner of the frame, I remember. And after the film was over, there were 2 or 3 people just applauding and applauding and applauding for like 20 minutes. It was moving. It was so overwhelming. I mean, not that, I don't say this where I said pick up a gun and go and shoot, but it has to do with that image is like the most eloquent image of, in cinema that expresses that injustice will always be resisted. Always. One way or the other. It's just going to happen. Because he stays on the screen, and you hear those gunshots. And this image is incendiary. And I saw the reaction in the audience. It was powerful. And so that's poetry, but you can also say it's politics. But the poetry's first. So maybe he's right. I got Glauber Rocha I met over the years, then I started making films. There's no doubt Antonio das Mortas had like a major impact on Mean Streets and on Raging Bull. On Raging Bull, we put in some Brazilian music in homage to Glauber. There's a couple of pieces of music in there. But in any event, I think last time I saw him was in Venice, 1980, I think. Yeah. But before that, we had Tom Luddy brought him over to I had a small house in Los Angeles, and we had a dinner as Tom Luddy, myself, and Glauber, and I showed him The Big Shave, his short I had made. And we looked at a John Ford film, The Horse Soldiers. Yeah, The Horse Soldiers. Not a great John Ford film, but it had, he liked Ford, and he liked Westerns, he told me.
Era uma espécie assim de cruzar João Ford com Jean Vigo e com Eisenstein.
I think it's Antonio. I think. But I go back and forth. There's Land and Anguish and Barlavento. But I like very much Antonio's the one I keep checking back with. I keep showing to people if I think they deserve it. Because sometimes some people are gone. I mean, some people like zombies. They have no more feeling or something. I don't know. And I think it's good to show it to people who will, that it might help them in their work. Or even if they reject it, it's something for them to have a reaction to, rather than what's being presented today. But no, I think it's Antonio. I go back and forth with Antonio. The music is always in my head, and I know it very well. It's fresh. It's new. It doesn't cater to tastes of the box office, or I mean the box office in a bad way, of a traditional, okay, now we're going to sit you down and tell you a nice story. This punches you in the face, you see, and wakes you up. It opens your eyes. And that's what you need today, more than ever.